everyone. Good afternoon. It's great. We have a really good turnout of folks who have joined us this afternoon for a discussion on pathways to social housing. We have a great discussion lined up for everyone today. I just wanted to point your attention to the Q&A part of the Zoom console. That's where we'll be taking your questions. So throughout the discussion, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions as we move forward, and we'll answer as many as we can. So with that, I'm going to get the program started. And first, I'd love to introduce our CEO and president of the Community Service Society, David Jones, for some remarks.
Good afternoon. I'm David Jones, President and CEO of the Community Service Society of New York. Thank you for being here. CSS is proud to convene this important panel discussion, bringing together elected officials, community organizers, and advocates to discuss how to establish a vibrant social housing system in our city. For decades, CSS has produced research and advocacy promoting the maintenance and expansion of our state's social housing stock, including reports and campaigns on public housing, Mitchell-Lama, community, land trusts, and much more. In our latest reports, Pathways to Social Housing in New York, we are proud to present a bold new chapter in our long campaign for safe, affordable, and stable housing for all New Yorkers. Pathways is not just a compendium of data and descriptions, but a roadmap for how the city can integrate policy ideas from various corners of New York's housing movements into a large-scale vision for social housing conversions. I want to acknowledge the report's co-authors, Oksana Murova, Samuel Stein, Celeste Hornback, and Jacob Udell for their great work on this report. Now I'd like to turn things over to CSS Vice President for Policy and Research and Advocacy, Emerita Torres.
Thank you so much, David, for your remarks. And yes, my name is Emerita Torres. I'm the Vice President for Policy at CSS, and grateful to be here with my colleagues who have produced this wonderful report. So now I'm going to turn to our Comptroller, our New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander, who's also going to share some remarks with us today.
Hello, Community Service Society and friends. I'm New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, and I'm delighted to join you today virtually for the release of this fantastic report, Pathways for Social Housing in New York. Disappointed not to be able to join you in person, not quite as disappointed as I was not to get to go to Vienna, but still. This is a dynamite report, and it really builds on the Community Service Society's decades of work on affordable and specifically social housing. Big congratulations to the authors of the report, Oksana Miranova, Sam Stein, Jacob Udell, and of course the Comptroller's Office's own Celeste Hornback. And while he's not a co-author of this report, I want to say like a special personal thank you and lots of gratitude to the incomparable Vic Bach. Vic, you have been an extraordinary partner, leader, researcher, voice for affordable housing and for the vulnerable folks in our city who so need it. Thank you for all you've done. Congrats on your retirement at the end of the month. The housing crisis continues unabated in New York City. That is no secret. As we come out of the pandemic and think about what inclusive growth looks like, there is no challenge more urgent than affordable housing for a more equal, a more inclusive New York City. The eviction crisis continues unabated. Even though rents have skyrocketed in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, it's actually in the Bronx where the top 7 neighborhoods and 8 of the top 10 for people facing evictions from their home continues. Tens of thousands of people are facing eviction without the lawyers, the right to counsel that they are supposed to have at this moment. And of course, it's nearly impossible for young people to find an affordable place to rent, much less own. Homelessness now is at an all-time high, and folks so often can't get out of shelter into affordable housing because even though we increased the levels for those city FEPS vouchers, it's still basically impossible to find a place you can use them, either because the rents are too damn high or because landlords are breaking the law that says they have to take vouchers, source of income discrimination, and still doing it. Meanwhile, the crisis has spread to market rate housing as well, to folks who would not have thought they would be facing eviction. But as a result of what happened during the pandemic, now you've got so many formerly rent-regulated units, now market rate units, where middle class, even upper middle class families are getting thrown out of their homes so private equity-backed landlords can jack up the rents from, say, $3,000 to $5,000 a month when the median rent is $4,000 a month in Manhattan, and when we don't have good cause eviction protections or the right to a renewal lease. We've got so many families who have now become precarious in their housing who did not expect to. 3 Ds of social housing. Decommodification. Make sure that it's removed from the speculative marketplace so it can't sell for 3 times what it sold for a couple years ago and require people to get kicked out of their homes who can't afford to pay it. Decommodification. Deep affordability, because if you're going to have a right, that means everybody needs to be able to have a home. That's a key feature of social equality, another essential element. And finally, democratic management, so that the people who live there have a voice, have a say. As we turn to this new moment, one good opportunity is to say, let's look back at the past, because New York City has in its history maybe the best affordable housing program that we've created as a great model for the future. I'm talking, of course, about Mitchell-Lama. From 1955 to 1981, 135,000 units were created under the Mitchell-Lama program. About half of them were rentals owned by for-profit developers. About half of them were limited equity cooperatives owned by their residents. And that opportunity to compare really shows the value of social housing. Those co-ops offered affordable homeownership opportunities to working class residents. And here's what happened. All these decades later, over half of the rental Mitchell-Lama units have been privatized, removed from the affordable housing program. They're no longer a resource of regulated affordable housing. But 90%, more than 90%, of the Mitchell-Lama co-ops remain in the program. They remain as limited equity cooperatives. They remain as social housing, despite overwhelming financial incentives that those families would have to vote to come out of the program. Only about 7% of cooperative Mitchell-Lama units have exited affordability and gone private. And what that says is residents of those buildings recognize the extraordinary value of social housing. Rather than taking a quick buck, they see that the opportunity for their kids and grandkids to live in integrated, affordable communities, and for New York City itself to have something that enables working class families to be homeowners is worth it. So you see there that social housing works. It keeps neighborhoods more integrated. Think about what the Lower East Side or Williamsburg would be without their Mitchell-Lama housing. And it really points the way toward the future. Social housing is not the only strategy for that. I think we need a model of democratic comprehensive planning where we say, how many new units do we need overall? At what incomes? What kinds of investments in our infrastructure need to come along with it? How do we make sure that it is more integrated and inclusive and creates opportunities? And I think if people could see we're on a plan, not just to more housing, but to a more affordable and inclusive city, that it'd be possible to make sure every neighborhood does its share, which is not the system that we have today. One thing I really like about social housing is that it provides in the housing market what we sometimes call a public option. That's something like public higher education, like CUNY and SUNY, and it exists in healthcare as well, like Medicare or Medicaid. In a marketplace where you have some significant amount of market transaction going on, if you also have a robust public option like social housing, first, of course, that helps the people who get the affordable housing they couldn't afford in the marketplace. But if you look at higher ed, it's actually been shown that the competition of including public options in a broader mix helps create a better ecosystem for everyone. And I really think that's true in housing today. We do need in New York City more market rate housing, more market rate growth. You can see that with these units at $4,000 or $5,000 a person. But if we also had a robust social housing sector, a real public option, not just with NYCHA, but also housing owned by community development corporations, land trusts, limited equity co-ops, mutual housing, we could have a much healthier housing market. It's that two-track path forward that is the key to genuinely inclusive growth. Okay, so concretely, how do we get there? Right now, 80% of our subsidies, our tax breaks, our city land that goes for affordable housing goes to for-profit private developers, overwhelmingly for rental housing, instead of to this model of social housing that the report shows that we need. How do we change that? How do we make sure that, let's say at least half, maybe over time even more, of our resources for affordable housing go to social housing? Well, this report lays out 20 policies in that direction, and my office is proud to be working with people on a bunch of them. So we should have a policy that says when the city takes city-owned land, a precious, scarce resource, and puts it out for affordable housing, it can't go to a speculative for-profit private developer and over time become unaffordable. It's got to go to a social housing owner, a community land trust, a limited equity co-op, a CDC, supportive housing, so it stays permanently affordable with those 3 Ds in place. We could pass COPA at the city level or TOPA at the state level that gives communities or tenants an option to purchase, so that if their building's going to get sold, they have the first option as tenants, or the community as a land trust has a first option to purchase it and make it social housing. We could create a land bank for New York City, a bill that I sponsored last maybe 2 or 3 cycles in the city council, so that when there's an opportunity to acquire, for example, distressed hotels as we saw during the pandemic, or maybe a vacant industrial building, the city could acquire it and then convert it to social housing via one of these social housing owners, a land trust or a nonprofit. We could have a new model for lien sales, so that if folks fall behind on their taxes and ultimately can't afford to pay them, that instead of it being sold off in the marketplace, those units become social housing, folks would be able to stay, and then over time the buildings would become a resource for affordable housing in New York City. One thing we could also do now, I believe, is 421A expired last spring. How great was that? But, you know, 421A had this model for what do we want to see in the outer boroughs? Well, what if instead of 421A, we give a tax break to new, genuinely and deeply affordable social housing? That would be a good use of our tax dollars to create and expand social housing. Finally, I want to point out that social housing really does have to go hand in hand with strengthened tenant protections. That's why, you know, we've got to pass good cause protections in Albany. We need to make sure that the right to counsel people are supposed to have under existing city law is genuinely honored. You can't ask tenants who are fearing that they're going to be kicked out of their homes and kicked out of their neighborhoods to embrace an option for growth. And what we're trying to do here is make it possible for people to have confidence they could stay in their city. Because if you know you're not going to get kicked out of your home, you keep paying your rent, but you're protected by good cause eviction. Or your unit, there's not a unit next door that's being warehoused because somebody went out and no new affordable family got to come in. If we can strengthen tenant protections alongside a robust expansion of social housing, then I think we could persuade people that growth could be good for them, for their families, for their communities, if we get that kind of growth where everybody feels included, but also where new housing and new housing opportunities are created. Another path forward is possible. This report points the way. Let's do the work to achieve it.
Wow, thank you so much to the Comptroller, Brad Lander, for those really comprehensive remarks. He truly gets it on what we're talking about here today, from the 3Ds and social equity and beyond. So really grateful for the Comptroller for providing that context and the foundation for the discussion today. So before we get into it, I wanted to acknowledge some of the elected officials who are in the room listening. We also have a couple of elected officials who will actually be on the panel. I'm grateful for them as well. But for now, I'm going to quickly acknowledge those who are in the room listening. First, we have State Senator Jabari Bridgeport from District 25 in Brooklyn, a member of the Senate Housing Committee. Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal from District 67 in Manhattan, member of the Assembly Housing Committee. Also Assembly Member Dr. Anna Keels, District 125 in Ithaca, also a member of the Housing Committee in the Assembly. Audrey Sun of the City Council's Housing and Buildings Committee. And finally, just a special thank you to all of the staff members of those who are elected or in the various administrations and government in New York who have joined us today. Thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague at the Community Service Society, housing policy analyst, and one of the co-authors of the report, Sam Stein, to take us away from the next segment.
Thank you, Amarita, and thank you so much to all the folks who have joined us today from all over New York State. We're very excited today to launch this report. It's been about 1.5 years in the making. This report is in many ways a follow-up to our November 2020 report by the same group of co-authors, Oksana Mironova, Celeste Hornbach, Jacob Udell, and myself. That one was titled Corporate Windfalls or Social Housing Conversions, the Looming Mortgage Crisis and the Choices Facing New York. That report set up the stakes of this moment. We've had years of over-leveraging of the housing stock built on the assumption of constantly rising property values, rents, profit margins, and sales prices. That assumption was challenged by political changes, important political changes, very good political changes to celebrate, like the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act and right to counsel, but also by COVID's effect on the housing market and the people of New York. At that moment, we saw giant corporate investors poised to step in, and we argued instead for state action, city, state, and federal action to promote social housing conversions instead of allowing those giant corporate actors to take advantage of the situation. So we were saying social housing now, but that left the question of social housing how. We got requests from politicians and elected officials, as well as a lot of organizers, for something like a menu or a matrix of options, as well as more clarity about the actors, what it might cost, how the different policies would connect to each other. And so we took that on with 3 main goals. The first goal was to connect struggles around the democratization of land and housing with struggles around tenants' rights. Our central argument is that the road to social housing is paved by establishing more universal housing rights. This sets up a ground on which tenants can organize for even greater levels of affordability, democracy, and social equality, the fundamental pillars of a social housing program, as we heard from the Comptroller. It also puts pressure on landlords to back away from the most exploitive housing practices, like raising rents while failing to maintain their buildings. The second goal was laying out our case in a way that is easily accessible to multiple audiences, including, first and foremost, tenants and homeless New Yorkers who are active in housing movements across the state, organizers, technical assistance providers, and policy analysts in housing organizations around New York City and New York State, and finally, government workers, including elected officials and their staff, as well as local, state, and federal agency staff. And third and finally, we sought to build on the Community Service Society's legacy of research on social housing in New York, including reports over the decades by researchers like John Krinsky and Sarah Hovde, Tom Waters and Vic Bach, and Tom Waters and Oksana Mironova, and more. The final product of all that work over the last 1.5 years is Pathways to Social Housing in New York, 20 policies to shift from private profit to public good. We released a PDF of this last week, and today we are launching it publicly and we'll be releasing a website as well. The report starts with an introduction, which has a historical and theoretical framing for the work, explains why we're doing this and how it all fits together. It's really a must read. So I highly encourage folks to check out the introduction before diving into each of the policies. Then we have 4 sections, each containing 5 policies. The 4 sections are: Part 1, democratic control of housing. Part 2, financial resources for housing justice. Part 3, tenants' rights and protections. And Part 4, code enforcement and tools for safe conditions. As I said, within each of those 4 buckets, there are 5 policies each, which say exactly what we should do to make each of those a reality. We encourage everyone to read the report in print or on the website to learn more about each of them. Each policy description includes the following elements. First, a brief summary of what it is and how it would work. Second, the responsible jurisdiction. So is this something the local governments would do, the state government, the federal government, some combination? Next, the budget type. Does it cost capital money? Does it cost operating money over time? Or is it budget neutral or even revenue positive? Next, we have the legal process to make this happen. Does it require legislation? Is it an administrative change, or does it require judicial action? Then we connect each of those 20 policies with 3 other policies in the report. So you see how this all works together and connects into something larger. And then finally, we talk about the potential impact of each of these policies. We spell that out in writing, but we also have an infographic to help make the point. In the conclusion, we say what needs to happen, which is get organized. We encourage people to join housing organizations, to join the movement for social housing conversions in New York. We also provide a reading and viewing list of resources of documentary films, articles, reports, books about social housing, especially in New York. So it's a 55-page report, and that's a lot to read from cover to cover, but it doesn't have to be read linearly. We wanted to create a website that would help people move through the report more easily, but contain all the same content as the static report. And so now I'm going to show you that website. Hold on one second. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see this screen now. So this is the Pathways to Social Housing in New York website, I believe going live as we speak this moment on the Community Service Society overall website. So this is the homepage where you have first a table of contents, the beginning of the introduction, and then we encourage everyone to click here and read the full introduction, setting up what Pathways to Social Housing in New York is, how it connects to other Community Service Society reports, and more. Returning to the home screen, you'll see below that the 4 main policy types: democratic control of housing, financial resources for housing justice, tenants' rights and protections, code enforcement, and tools for safe conditions. Each of these contains the 5 policies I was talking about before. So to demonstrate, this is the page for democratic control of housing. You get this little sort of cityscape, and each one represents a different policy. So if we were to click on one of them, let's say this one, transform land banks into social housing intermediaries, we'll zoom in and get a quick description of the policy here. And then each of the kind of categories I was talking about before. This could be done at the local and state level. It requires both capital and operating costs. The processes are both legislative and administrative. Then we can learn a lot more about this policy. So this is a little bit about the impact with graphics, a description of the policy itself, and how, in this example, how we have land banks in parts of New York State, but not in New York City, the difference between a land bank that's oriented toward social housing versus one that's oriented toward private housing. Then we have the connections. Land banks as social housing intermediaries connects with supporting social housing infrastructure, reimagining public disposition and municipal foreclosure, and acquiring distressed debt. Each of those is a link that will take you to those connections. And then we have a paragraph of text for each policy that explains how those three things fit together with land banks as social housing intermediaries. Then we have a set of impacts that use the data available to us to think about what might the impact of this policy be. You can either close out from here or move next to the next policy, and so on. When you close out of here, you're back in this scene of community control of public and private land and democratic control of housing. There is also a summary here of kind of what this all means. Right here. What it means to have democratic control of housing. We also have an about page that explains what all this is, what the pathways to social housing in New York are, and the different symbology we use throughout the report for jurisdictions, for budget, for process, and so on. You can download the PDF of the report and print it out if you prefer reading it that way. And you can also share on social media direct from the website. So this is the Pathways to Social Housing website. Out now, we strongly encourage folks to check out the website, check out the PDF of the report, and learn more about how we can convert more for-profit housing into social housing throughout New York. We have all the co-authors of the report here now. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so I'll give it one moment. It's possible that Pathways to Social Housing is just so clear that there are absolutely no questions. We'd be, happy to answer any that do come up. All right, perhaps we should move to our next segment. Oh, are there dollar figures attached to any of the proposals? Some yes, some no. Some it was easy. There are small local versions of this, so we can extrapolate what it might cost to go statewide. Others, it's not so easy, and so instead we talk about other kinds of impacts. But always we talk about what kind of budget ask it would be. Is it budget neutral? Is it revenue positive? Is it operating, or is it capital? Thank you, Senator Brisbois, for that question. What is the incentive of private developers to become involved? Well, as the controller was saying before, private developers have opted into programs like Mitchell-Lama, which essentially guarantee long-term returns at a lower rate than the increasingly crazy speculative market, but also more secure. The housing that's created in social housing is very stable into the long term. And so if you're looking to invest your money in a stable sort of way, that is an incentive. We have our friend from the UK asking if we foresee any problems with merging all non-market housing into the term social housing. It has caused some serious problems in the UK. Thank you, Glenn. That is certainly something that we've talked about specifically. We have public housing, we have co-op social housing, we have rental social housing, we have nonprofit housing. I think the way that I would answer that question is that there was a report put out by Oksana Mironova and Tom Waters from the Community Service Society talking about social housing as a spectrum. It was called How Social Is That Housing? And we looked at all the different types of not-for-profit housing you might call social housing in New York and showed what they were strong at and what they were weak at. Some were very strong on democratic participation, but not so great on affordability. Some were the opposite. Some had real commitments to social equality, some not so much. And so I think it's okay to talk about a lot of different types of housing as social housing, as long as we're not painting them as all the same. They do different things, they reach different people, they have different strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully we can work to make the program that has the best at decommodification, the best at affordability, the best at democratic control. But for now, we should see our existing social housing as pretty variable in terms of each of those three pillars. A question about who will be in charge of conducting the enforcement and what will be the civil penalties. So one of our report buckets is about strengthening building code enforcement. There are parts of New York State that have a very sort of strong and centralized building code enforcement regime as it is. There are others that really have next to nothing. And so the first goal is just leveling the playing field. The second is ensuring that local housing agencies or public housing authorities have the resources they need to do enforcement. I'm also realizing that I'm answering all these questions because I'm reading them from the Q&A, but I want to encourage my co-authors to jump in as well if you have anything you'd like to add. There was a question that I think I missed before, so thank you for re-asking it, Jay. Question is, do you have a component of how to defend current social housing like Mitchell-Lama? That's a great point. We don't have it under that name. We certainly have defending tenant protections that exist as a broad category, but I think you're absolutely right. We really do need to defend Mitchell-Lama, and there was some excellent legislation passed in the last session that gets us some of the way there. Maybe I'll pass to my coworker, Oksana Mironova, who I see is unmuted.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that even though the focus of this report is really on encouraging new social housing conversions, a lot of the financial resources that we talk about could be used by our legacy social housing stock, which Mitchell-Lama co-ops are absolutely a part of. I should say I live in the Mitchell-Lama co-op, so I have a very strong personal investment in making sure that the existing buildings continue to be permanently affordable and democratically controlled in perpetuity. So yeah, I would look at the financing components of the report and make those connections there.
Great, thanks.
And can I add one quick thing, Sam?
Please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Udell, one of the co-authors of the report. Happy to be here with everyone. Yeah, just a little thing to add on the idea of calling it social housing, which I think Sam got at. I think connects to the Mitchell-Lama question as well, which is that I think we're trying to sort of break down the dichotomy between NYCHA public housing and then all the other interesting and impressive forms of social housing that we have in New York City and New York State, from Mitchell-Lama's to HTFC nonprofit rentals to limited equity co-ops. All of those things are sort of under one bucket. And though I could imagine, yeah, from a UK perspective, there are questions about whether calling all of that social housing kind of allies between some important differences. For us, it's also really important to be able to see that as a spectrum of organizing and social housing that has been created in the past, and to defend that together as a block. So even if we're not thinking about Mitchell-Lama specifically in this report, I think the shift that we and many others in New York City and state have been part of in terms of calling it social housing is I think a little bit about trying to defend all of those forms, which are all important in this. Thanks.
Great. Now we've got a lot of questions and possibly more than we have time for, but that's great. And we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can get to in the next couple minutes. Caroline asked, how would this differ from the minimum state standards for code enforcement? Other co-authors may have more to add, but the first thing I'd say is just that they are very minimal. There's a lot more in terms of code enforcement that some parts of New York State have, New York City, for example. And so it's leveling up and making sure that landlords in other parts of the state can get away with much lower upkeep standards than we would expect in New York City, but also making sure that in New York City, we actually do all the enforcement to enforce the rules that are on the books. Any other comments about that question? Celeste, we see you talking, but I can't hear you. Anybody? Okay.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
I realized what I had wrong. Okay, thank you. I was just going to say, I think this relates also to more rural areas of upstate New York. And a lot of like the cities and towns there are, but in a lot of other areas, it's like unclear exactly who has jurisdiction, you know, and even like sort of well-meaning local officials who want to enforce tenant protections like are a little bit stumped as to how to best do that. So I think some of this too is just creating like a framework so that tenants all across the state have the same level of rights and just are able to know exactly who to call when they have issues, and that there's like a clear process for that to be enforced.
Great, thanks, Celeste. We have a comment from Catherine Clark saying the community-based nonprofits offer a model that operates along that spectrum, focus on keeping profits in the building. More of this type of housing and inclusion for nonprofits over private developers go a long way to, whoops, that just disappeared as I was reading it, but we agree. And that is included in the report talking about both traditional nonprofits, but also community land trusts and other forms of collective ownership, and ensuring that when social housing development happens, especially on public land, that not-for-profit organizations have first opportunity. We're supposed to turn over at 1:40. I'm going to just ask one more or answer one more question while it's here, which I believe is from Rico. It says, do you see any possibility of using public employee pension funds to invest in social housing? And this is an issue I'm particularly interested in, so I'll give a first answer, which is to say, that has been the way that some great models of affordable housing have been financed in New York. I would love to see a return to that. There has, however, been changes in the federal rules about how unions can invest their money that puts up some challenges to that, that takes away some of the agency of unions to invest directly in not-for-profit housing. So that might be one that would be a lot easier to do. We can get changes at the federal scale. And that kind of, we can close the Q&A at this moment there, but that points to the way that this is a multi-scalar issue, and that's why we wrote Pathways to Social Housing the way that we did, to get involved the federal, state, and local governments, and to connect the issues across those jurisdictions. So we're going to move next to our panel. Thank you all for listening to the presentation about the report, and I can't wait to hear more from our panelists.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. I am going to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras if they're able to. And I believe that you all are here. Okay, great. So thank you so much. Thanks to Sam for the preview of the report and the report website. I really hope that all of you who are here listening, and by the way, there's so many of you, that's amazing. And thank you so much for all of your engagement and questions. It's really heartening to see New Yorkers really engage with this idea. I think it's a really good sign for things to come. So yeah, I really hope you're able to kind of dig into the report. It's a lot to get your hands around immediately, which is why we created the website. And it gives you space to navigate all of the different 20 proposals that we bring together, hopefully in a way that's a little bit easier and more understandable, but you could tell us if that's not true. And we welcome all of your feedback. The goal of the report, and I'm going to speak on behalf of my three co-authors and myself, but and they could correct me if I'm wrong, but the goal is really to create something that's usable by organizers, by elected officials, by advocates across the board. And the four main categories that we break the 20 policies and laws into, which are tools for conversions, roughly finance, tenants' rights, and code enforcement, really need to work in tandem to create a landscape where social housing could thrive. And as our controller talked in the beginning, we have a really strong social housing legacy in New York State, but it's under attack in a lot of ways. It's been eroded, and as a lot of questions in the Q&A alluded to, there is kind of like, we need to defend what we have, but we also need to move forward as well without losing sight of what we have. So the panel that we bring together for you today has both elected officials and organizers who are working towards the idea of social housing in New York State, and are thinking about social housing not esoterically, but really, really concretely in terms of specific campaigns or specific laws and programs that they're fighting towards, either on the legislative track or on the organizing track. And this includes everything from organizing at the building level towards social housing conversion, to organizing for tenant power across the state, to fighting for laws like TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, changes to the tax lien sale, code enforcement strengthening, and other things that our panelists will get into. So to give you all a sense of what the panel is going to look like, the panelists are going to speak. I'm going to ask all the panelists a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for Q&A. So please, as you're listening, you could put your questions in the chat, or you could wait till the end. But if stuff comes up as the panelists are talking, please, we encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box. So with us today, we have Claudia Waterton, who is the president of a tenant association that's becoming a board in a very recent social housing conversion in Port Morris in the Bronx. We have Genevieve Rand, who is an organizer with Citizen Action and with Housing Justice for All. Then we have Marcela Mityanis, who is an assembly member from Brooklyn, council member Pirina Sanchez, who is a council member from the Bronx, and also the head of the housing committee in the city council. And we have council member Sandy Nurse, who is also a council member from Brooklyn. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Claudia to begin.
Hi, my name is Claudia. I'm president of my board. So back in February of this month, we finally bought our building from our landlord. We were going through a housing case, DHCR. He was trying to destabilize our building. And for years, we were going back and forth trying to fight. And towards the end, we decided that we wanted to buy the building because we saw that there was an opportunity of him selling. And I want to say the sound in the background, that's my radiator. So don't mind that. But anyway, typical New York apartment. But so yes, we decided to buy our building. We were trying to get funding from the city, part funding from the city, and part was supposed to come from a private foundation. Right before COVID was when we got the funding from the city, but then COVID happened and the funding got taken away. The private foundation that was going to give part of the funding was able to give us the rest in order for us to buy the building. So right now, we fully have the building. We're in the middle of converting into HDFC, DFC co-ops. So we're in the middle of training to become a co-op. And we're also, we went through the process of hiring our management company, interviewing, doing contracts and all that stuff, getting us prepared to be able to run our co-op successfully. And I'm here to support TOPA because I see what it takes in order for us to get our building to where it is. And I want other tenants to do the same thing. There's other tenants going through the same struggles that we are going through, where their landlord is selling their building, their landlord's not doing enough to fix the stuff in their building, and they want to buy. The money isn't there yet. And hopefully with TOPA, will give us the money for other tenants to buy their buildings and hopefully go on the same process that I'm dealing with now. Thank you.
Claudia, thank you so much for that. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Genevieve.
Hello, my name is Genevieve. I work on statewide housing campaigns for Citizen Action of New York, which is a steering member of the Housing Justice for All Coalition. And what I am here to talk about and add to the conversation is how the immediate policies that we're fighting for in this coming legislative session, many of which we've fought for in the past session too, relate to this longer term vision of realizing a social housing system in New York and in the United States, looking towards the medium term with the Social Housing Development Authority, and in the short term with Good Cause, TOPA, HAVP, and also some still coming together reforms to the way that rent guidelines boards are structured. I think that in broad terms, when social housing is done well in mostly in places outside of the United States, but with some programs here too, a big part of that is the institutionalization of the administration and the organizing of tenants. And we have some examples, like code enforcement is something that came up earlier, where we have very good minimum standards and we have an institution that's responsible for this, but the people who are affected by it, tenants, don't have a way to participate in the enforcement themselves. So tenant organizing isn't able to be effectively part of that institution under the current system. And in order to get towards that institutionalization, we need to fund our own programs, right? Which is a big part of what we're talking about here. But we're also going to need to no matter where you are on the political spectrum, it's pretty widely agreed that a pure speculative, purely profit-driven real estate market has some really bad effects that come out of it. And we need to fight those bad effects and curb and disincentivize the worst parts of runaway speculation. And so these three policies, so Good Cause is essentially the right to a renewal lease for tenants who are unregulated. TOPA, as Claudia started to hit on, is both a program for tenants to buy their own housing, but also, and appropriating some state money for that, but also an opportunity for tenants who are in any building that's in the process of getting sold to intervene in that sale process and choose, even if they're not buying it themselves and the funding for that isn't able to get secured, choose who is ending up in ownership and management of that building. And then HAVP is funding, the Section 8 voucher system and administering it through the state, which in the short term gets people into housing or gets people stable in housing who aren't right now, but in the long term can be a funding source for social housing, can be a funding source for the subsidies and the sort of project-based, you could move money between the different kinds of subsidies and vouchers. But all of these together represent, the disincentivization and curbing of the worst parts of speculation by giving tenants ways to intervene, including enforcing the rights that we already have, right, through Good Cause, protecting us from eviction if we try to enforce the rights we already have and are labeled as problem tenants. TOPA is a way for us to institutionalize our organizing and interact with the building sale process, whether that's through receivership into social housing or just getting used to making landlords and owners compete over what's going to appeal to tenants rather than just compete over the best financial deal on a speculative market. And then, well, I already said Good Cause, but these are all sort of groundwork layers that we see as part of protecting and institutionalizing the organizing that we have, giving it new goals, like with TOPA, giving it a way to intervene with the building sale process, and all of that together coming together to curb speculation and give tenants more stability and long-term tenancy in their housing, which then has a positive feedback loop with organizing, strength, and stability. So it's a groundwork layer now, but like I said, in the long term, this is looking towards setting up what we need, not just to jump into a social housing development authority like totally blind, but with institutions and practice with receivership and building ownership and administration, like in our repertoire as we go into that down the line.
Thank you so much for that, Genevieve. And yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying good cause over and over again. That's like totally fine. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Assemblymember Marcela Mitianes. I think that you're still on, but possibly on the phone.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, okay. I'm having trouble with my video, so I'm so sorry. I can't seem to turn it on. Thanks. So I am Assemblymember Marcela Martinez, and I represent the 51st Assembly District in South Brooklyn. That's the neighborhood of Sunset Park, Red Hook, and part of Bay Ridge. I kind of came through this through my own housing insecurity, where I was displaced from the rent-stabilized apartment that I shared with my family for over 30 years. Not really understanding what was happening, but very quickly got plugged in with a community organization called Neighbors Helping Neighbors, and really started to understand the way politics worked, and how a pattern of displacement during a time that our neighborhood was gentrifying that I didn't realize was happening at the time, to then connecting with legislation that was enacted that allowed this to happen, and who were the people that were who were the people that had the power to make these decisions, and then slowly getting involved in understanding, how much politics is involved with the real estate, how much of the real estate has a hold. And so it's been a huge learning experience. I did that for about 10 years before I came into the assembly, and met a lot of amazing folks along the way and learned a lot. And I think that to the credit of the tenant movement and those amazing tenant leaders, there's been a really big shift in politics in the way the real estate industry and its power. And so the trip to Vienna and the report is just, for me, it feels like an acclamation or a recognition of things that we have said and seen throughout the years. And so kind of having this example of what could really happen and what we could really do, and understanding that this is also part of a longer term organizing that we have to do. But things like the gentrifying of our communities through the city's program of affordable housing, and how community members raise the issue of overcrowdedness and having new people coming in, and concerns around infrastructure, when the report shows that in Vienna, how there is a different way of being able to build, to really take these things into consideration, to really be able to build in a way that you're responding to the needs of a community. And so I think that it's really important that we share the things that we learned, right, including things and legislation that we have here, and like was mentioned about the TOPA, and really identifying pathways and ways that we can empower our folks to be able to take on property like this, right, and be able to be owners and be able to move from the working class to the middle class and find pathways like this. So I'm really excited about being here and the conversation that we're having. And this is not something that we're going to be able to change overnight, but we also know that we can't. We didn't get here. We didn't get here overnight, and it's really been a struggle and a chiseling and breaking apart of this huge obstacle that we have. And so I'm just thankful for being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Assembly Member. I'm probably gonna, just to give you a heads up, I'm gonna come back to you and ask you to explain the Vienna trip a little bit more because it came up a couple of times, and I think that I'm assuming a lot of our audience has no idea what we're talking about, but it's relevant. Okay, next I'm gonna hand it over to Council Member Sandy Nurse.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me and for putting out this report. I represent the 37th Council District, which is at this point becoming most of Bushwick, the northern part of Ocean Hill and Brownsville, Cypress Hills, East New York, and City Line. And the piece that I'm kind of highlighting today is really around property tax and acquiring tax burdened properties that are in distress and have liens on them. And one of the things that our team has really been focused on is in coalition is the tax lien sale, abolishing it, but restructuring the way property tax is collected. And so for those, this seems like a very in the choir room, in the participant space, but for those of you who don't know, the tax lien sale is this Giuliani era policy that essentially privatized the way we collected municipal property debt. And under the tax lien sale, when someone doesn't pay their property taxes for a period of time, the city sells that debt to a private trust that serves as an investment vehicle for essentially Wall Street companies, hedge funds, speculators. And really what that does is exposes small homeowners, property owners to the private market where bondholders can increase interest up to 18%, put a bunch of fines on and charges on homeowners who then have to borrow or hustle for more money to avoid foreclosure or really sell off their property to kind of cut their losses. So it's a really destructive process. It's deeply impactful, impacting my district. Certainly in Brownsville, Crown Heights, East New York, these are places where we have over 100 up to 148 homes per district on the tax lien sale.
Oh, Councilmember, you are on mute or went on mute.
Sorry. So how that really ties to social housing is basically that the city, by privatizing the way we collect property tax debt, the city really loses the leverage to create social housing in a really practical way. And by restructuring the tax lien sale, we essentially could intervene in this process and funnel properties into the hands of mission-driven nonprofits, so community land trusts like the East New York Community Land Trust, shout out to Hannah and Deborah and other folks that are on here, to community development corporations, and really implement strong regulatory mechanisms to ensure these buildings remain permanently affordable, which ultimately helps us stabilize families and neighborhoods. So, what does an alternative look like? Essentially, together with the Abolish the Tax Lien Sale Coalition, our office has been working with other council members to kind of build out this critical mass of members who would be committed to ending the lien sale as it currently exists and implementing a more equitable alternative. And that would include essentially a waterfall of options and services for property owners, including language accessible outreach and wraparound services, options for owners to preserve equity through resale restrictions for full or partial debt forgiveness, chances to opt into community land trusts or CDC ownership with resale and affordability restrictions, and a lot more provisions. But ultimately, this is just one little piece of a pathway to social housing, but it is a very practical one in that it's not relying on new construction. This is about preserving units and building stock as is, but really, it needs to coincide. The restructuring and the abolishment of the tax lien sale really needs to coincide with passing the other state and local laws for more just disposition models that have been mentioned, TOPA, COPA, the land bank, which I know Councilmember Sanchez and I are co-primes with Councilmember Brewer, and other mechanisms. So it's just a small piece, but I think it goes to show that the city, if it removes this private tax collection, and it removes the kind of vulnerability of just subjecting our small homeowners to the private sector, which we know their only mission is to generate a profit through the resale of these properties, through the foreclosure of these properties. If we remove that and bring it back into the public realm, we could really have a very practical, concrete action step towards creating social housing. So thanks for letting me, for having me here and letting me talk about this.
Thanks so much for that, Council Member. Now I'm going to hand it over to Council Member Pirina Sanchez.
So thank you so much, and echoing the thanks. Thank you for having us here. So you might hear a very cute baby cooing because I am breastfeeding, but that's how we do it. We just do all the things. So I'm super excited that CSS has had this line of work for a number of years now, and this is the latest report. I just want to thank you for continuing to talk about social housing and for growing the conversation, because it's really a critical one. I think, what I wanted to share was back in 2010, when I first finished college and I was working for the council, that was the first time that I encountered HDFCs. There was an HDFC in District 14, actually, where I represent, in the Northwest Bronx, that was in round 10. It was in round 10 of the in-rem foreclosure proceedings. And we had a constituent come to the office. She was the president of the board, and she was in tears. She said, I've been living in this building since the late 70s. In the 80s, we were able to take control of the building, and it became a cooperative. And we own this property. We all own our units, and we love our units, but we've made mistakes in managing the property. And now we face foreclosure, and it's just not fair. Nobody ever helped us. Nobody ever, had our backs, but, the city has been quick to come and to foreclose. And, we worked with that building, with that tenant association, and, they eventually were taken out of round 10 and they remained a co-op. But back then, when I knew like zero things about housing, except that it was in crisis and sort of like a perennial, perpetual crisis, I remember thinking back then, like, what an incredible model that the city of New York has, where these cooperatives exist all over the city. They were created in mass a few decades ago, and they represent equity and home ownership opportunities, largely in communities of color that were abandoned in the time of white flight, in the time of preferential financing for white families, in a time where abandoning the Bronx and burning down the Bronx was what the real estate industry did. There were people who stayed, there were people who fought, and that still today translates to some degree of homeownership, although it hasn't been it hasn't been a smooth trip, right? It has been very rocky because we as a city, as a municipality, made mistakes. But all of that said, we can absolutely learn from the past. And so I joined Councilmember Nurse and, kind of focusing on the smaller portion of public disposition and municipal foreclosure, because it's part of the police power that we have at the city council. This is one of the areas where we have a lot of power, if we were just to exercise it as a city, to grow the amount of housing that is social, to grow the amount of existing properties and parcels and apartments that are currently in one state and can be turned to social housing. I really, in addition to the abolishing the tax lien sale coalition, there's also the third party transfer program, right? Which focuses on the distressed properties, those with a high number of B and C class violations, the subject of many, many reform discussions in the last council. I think there's also so much space there to say, okay, let's go after the worst actors and let's see how we can grow the stock. And just earlier today, I was talking to the tenant at 972 Franklin, I believe, Mr. Francis, who, if you just Google his name and his address, you'll see this horrible story of a 10-unit building that has been in disrepair for nearly a decade, has gone through 7A, has gone through various city enforcement programs. And, 10 years later, 15 years later, the property is still in disrepair. The tenant is still being harassed. He's trying to stay there. He's held out for all of this time, and he's getting sort of organizing support. But it's just a poster child of what is wrong with the way that we do housing in New York City. What is wrong with having speculation be a part of the DNA of how we choose to house New Yorkers, and how deep of a need there is to change the conversation around, building equity and strengthening communities. And I'll kind of just close with this. I'm very corny, as I'm sure this kid will grow to appreciate someday, or hate, or whatever. But I just, fundamentally think that, and believe that possibility doesn't exist. A lot of people will say, no, that's impossible. We can't do social housing. This isn't Europe. This isn't any other place. But possibility doesn't exist. Possibility is created. It's created by these kind of conversations where we get together and we imagine a better future, and we imagine what we can do on behalf of the lowest income New Yorkers, on behalf of the most vulnerable. And so I'm just excited to be a part of this conversation, to keep, to help and push and lend support however we can at the city, to our state colleagues on TOPA and on Good Cause, and then at the city to really explore deeply, how can we use our land use powers? How can we use our powers of public disposition in rent foreclosure, et cetera, to grow the stock and, stabilize our communities more?
Thank you so much for that, council member. That is it's a really great point to kind of end this portion of the conversation. And I love thinking about the kind of like the possibility of creating more social housing blooming out of this conversation. That's awesome. So I'm going to ask all of you a couple of questions, but just a reminder to our audience, if you have questions that are coming up for you, just put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them in a couple of minutes. So to begin, I want to ask Claudia a question. I know that when you all did your conversion, or kind of like put the conversion into process, there was like a ton of excitement from outside of your individual building, outside of the Bronx. It felt like this kind of like opening an opportunity where the example of all of your hard work and organizing like actually led to a good result, where you were able to take away a building from a landlord and to create a model that will hopefully work for you in perpetuity, and perhaps like for future generations as well. I mean, like obviously it's a very far away plan, but like thinking about this as like something that will hopefully continue to be useful to New Yorkers going forward. So I'd love to hear about like, what have other tenants reaching out to you, other people in the Bronx, other people in New York City, what have you been telling them? Like, what are the pathways to getting to where you all got to through your work?
So I have been telling people that, I think when people see our story, it seems so simple and easy. And I had to tell them it was not easy at all. It was very difficult. And we all had like ups and downs through this whole process. And I also try to tell them that like, don't use like our experience as a blueprint, because every building is different. Every tenants association is different. And even through this whole process, like, it wasn't like we all didn't initially agree, like, yeah, let's do this. We all had like different versions of what we thought owning the building would be. The one thing that we focused on was buying the building. That was the one thing that we all agreed on, no matter which way we thought we would do it, was buying the building. And every time we strayed from that, we brought it back to like, we want to buy the building, And as long as we focus on that one goal, we made sure that everything was accomplished. So I do tell people, it's going to be hard times. Get to know your neighbors, actually get to know your neighbors. There's people in your building that like you wouldn't think would be good leaders. There's people in your building you wouldn't think would be good talkers. Sometimes they're like janitors, nurses, teachers, you never know like what extra skills that they have outside of like their day-to-day job that can help your building move forth. And to be open about that and not just think, well, that person works as a nanny, like what can she do? You know what I mean? Like there's other stuff that her being a nanny or other stuff that she does outside being a nanny can help your organization. So be open to different people's experience, be open and learning your neighbors and pulling all the resources that each one of your neighbors can do to help your building move forth.
Thank you for that. And Genevieve, I feel like maybe you could add or kind of build off the track that Claudia opened up with talking about organizing on the building level and thinking about how building tenant power, especially statewide, you're the only person on the panel who has like a really good statewide perspective. And we are talking about social housing on the state level. Yeah, like how does building tenant power on the building level create the opportunity for more social housing broadly?
Yeah, I think, well, okay, zooming out, what I would ask everybody here to like think about is that tenant organizing, you know, there's 10 million or so people living in New York City, 10 million or so people living outside New York City in the state of New York. Tenant organizing for that other 10 million people often looks very, very different than it does in the city. And, you know, there's been all sorts of sort of like social housing and co-op programs that have been created in the city. Some of them are still around today. It's very different outside. The only one that really like still exists is the federal Section 9, which like is NYCHA in New York City, is other housing authorities outside of it. And I'm sure we all have our thoughts and feelings about that and want to like go into the future creating a system that is in some ways similar, in some ways different, but like there's a reason that in my part of speaking, I really heavily emphasize the institutionalization of our tenant organizing. And whenever like we're having policy discussions about how to structure these programs, one of the first questions that I always have is how do tenants living in like a single family home or a very small building, like participate in this program? Because often it's very easy to think about these giant buildings with thousands of people in them and not realize that almost none of those exist for half of the people who live in the state of New York. And so and in a sense, like having a giant building like that creates, you know, to some extent its own predefined community and like constituency for organizing. Outside of that, upstate New York, like the organizing looks very, very different in different places. There's a million different like methods, organization structures, ideologies that guide these organizations. And I know there's diversity in this down in the city too. But the reason that I emphasize so hard, the institutionalization and the protection through things like good cause of the tenant organizing that we already have and giving people a way to like participate in a TOPA program, even if the state money that's allocated to it is all maybe going to go to New York City or isn't going to, you know, go north of a certain part of the state. Giving people a way to participate in that, like, gives us literally the like structure we need to have a strong and united tenant movement across the state. And when we don't have that, when we have a bunch of different like organizing infrastructure or like institution structures and whatever that like different people participate in a bunch of different ways, we end up with sort of like the situation we're starting with in New York City right now, where there are, you know, regulated, unregulated, stabilized, rent controlled, co-op, like, you know, and then tons of different kinds of co-ops, NYCHA, like voucher-based subsidy, project-based subsidy, like there's so many different constituencies of tenants, and what that results in. And one of the big like struggles in the housing movement that Housing Justice for All has to like tackle is recognizing that all of these different programs and kinds of tenants all have different interests and like need to figure out how to push in the same direction on policy. And often we don't. Like often some big group already has the thing that we're trying to get for the rest of everybody else, or like we're picking something that only affects a smaller group of people. It's very difficult. And so and that provides and has provided a way for the private real estate industry to like divide and conquer the movement of organized tenants. And so as we're thinking about implementing a new social housing program, like for the future, making sure that it's as universal and as easy to participate in for tenants in as many different situations as possible is really important, not just for making sure that like the access to this is equitable, but also that it's like protected in the long term, because we're all united on like common interests in infrastructure as tenants who participate in the receivership, who live in new social house. Like, you know, this is a little bit of a rambly answer. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. I mean, that's like completely relevant. And as a follow-up, because you kind of started getting into both the different constituencies that Housing Justice for All works with, but the fact that every single constituency is impacted by different laws, by different programs. I'd love for you to touch on a little bit more the relationship between things like good cause and other types of laws that build tenant power and create space for tenants to organize, how that connects to social housing. That came up in the video that Brad Lander provided for us that we opened with as well. But yeah, I'd love to make that connection stronger for people who are listening.
Yeah, sure. So like practical example of this is and I think someone else is going to talk about this in a minute, but a bunch of us went to Vienna, and in Vienna, their social housing, like most of the people in Vienna, it's like 2/3 or something, live in socialized housing. Half of that is like straight up public municipal housing, and the other half is a sort of private program, but that's like created and structured and regulated very heavily by the government. That system has existed for the better part of 100 years and has been protected from being eclipsed by, you know, predatory private real estate speculation by that time, or during that time, not by like, well, not just by a really cool arrangement of like policies in the government, but also by like it sort of creates its own dominant constituency politically, because most 2/3 of the people there live in this housing. If you're going to do something to harm it as a politician, you're like going directly against the interests of 2/3 of the people who live there. And the Social Democratic Party in Vienna links itself really, really, really heavily to the social housing system, and sort of like politically like owns that system and is who introduced it in the first place. And so like that party organizes and politically engages the tenants in that housing, and like makes it an electoral issue each time. And it's like a big part of their campaigning and so on. My point with all of this, obviously, like we're far off from several aspects of that here, including the existence of a social democratic party, period. But like, my point is that there's an active and ongoing like organization of tenants and engagement in like politics that protects this system. And so again, like I've already talked a lot about how the protection and the institutionalization of tenant organizing sets us up to not just like win the creation of a social housing system, but to like implement, administer, and protect it politically long term. The other side of this is like the way that because in order to beat the private and speculative real estate market, and in order to beat the incentives of like collecting as much rent as possible and spending as little on repairs and amenities and so on as possible for the tenants, you have to figure out how to like interrupt and like counter the power of a totally profit-driven speculative market. And tenant protections like give tenants a direct way to like, if you know the incentive is to evict a bunch of people for no reason other than because you're realizing that you can redevelop this place and make it a lot more expensive, or without even redeveloping it, just make it way more expensive and not have to deal with a bunch of people like fighting rent hikes and whatever. Like you can't just kick everybody out and displace everybody and move like wealthier tenants in because there's good cause eviction protections and you can't obtain an eviction warrant from the state for the state to help you do that. In a zooming out, like, and you could say this, you know, for any other tenant protection, you could give examples of how this works, but zooming out, what this means is that as the market goes up and down, the private speculative market, which like is sometimes responding to real stimuli, sometimes it's like manufactured stimuli, like as when tenants have more control over what happens in the immediate future, whether that's like whether or not they're staying in their apartment or moving, or it's who's going to buy this apartment and what's going, or this building and what's going to happen during that, it puts like checks and balances on that speculation system and reduces the power of private real estate like owners and speculators to just wave a wand and do whatever they want with the market and with the people whose housing is like controlled by it. And so like TOPA, even though it's not exactly a tenant protection, it's still like a tenant power piece of legislation, because it gives tenants the power to interrupt. Just like a landlord can't just decide, ooh, the market's really hot right now, I really want to sell it to this like speculator, and I just like, you know, and I want to kick everybody out within it. Good cause prevents people from getting kicked out. What TOPA does is gives tenants like a year to whether or not they're buying that unit themselves. Like we've already talked about appropriating money to do it, but even if they're not buying the unit themselves, they can say, okay, we're not just going to pick that one like speculator as the landlord who's like willing to make this really big deal in this one moment. We're going to like ride this out, consider our different options based on who's offering us what looks like the best deal for us as tenants, and who can make the best case that they're going to manage it well and do repairs and so on. Like, and then that process can ride out the sort of like ups and downs of the speculative market and not make it this dramatic thing that's constantly going up and down and just uprooting tenants' lives without any opportunity for us to intervene in it. At least in theory. Like, and again, the creation of that law isn't the thing that actually delivers it. It's that it's us like going into buildings, whether it's our own buildings or other people's buildings, like Claudia and the other tenants in her building have done, and like actually taking and like using these laws ourselves and institutionalizing our own organizing to like use and enforce and administer the law. And so like huge plus to everything that Claudia said about like knowing your neighbors, understanding like that people that, you know, everybody's qualified to be a leader in this in some way or another. And that once we create these policies, it's actually up to us to enforce them essentially. Which like can kind of feel like it sucks, because kind of what you want is for somebody else to come along and like do everything for you and save you. But I think that we're kind of used to that because we're sort of propagandized with this image that we don't need to have power and control over our housing, and that in reality we'll live in a much better world if all of us are taking like our part in our initiative in that process.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Genevieve. And I think that this really connects to what Councilmember Sanchez was talking about with the third-party transfer program. So before, just because Vienna came up again, I'm going to ask a question to Assemblymember Mitianis. If she's still on the phone, maybe. Marcella, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, awesome.
My camera still won't turn on. I don't know what's going on. Okay.
No, it's
sorry.
okay. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the social housing delegation that you, Genevieve, myself, and a couple of other people who I know are either listening in or in the Zoom room right now we're on. Yeah, so I'd love for you to kind of like introduce it to our audience, and then maybe say one thing about how that trip and that work is going to influence the way that you think about legislation and the way that you think about social housing going forward.
Sure. It was about a group of 48 of us elected officials, both from the New York State Assembly and Senate, representatives from organizations and tenant leaders. We went to Vienna to talk to some elected officials, talk to some tenants, talk to people that work within the social housing, and just really learn about what they've been able to do and how they've been able to do it. And I go back a little bit to my earlier statement where part of the trip for me felt like a little bit of indication of the stuff that I feel like I've been screaming in my neighborhood and my neighbors have when we're fighting against development, and not because we're opposed to development, but because we don't think that we're getting enough in return based on what the developer is getting, right? And I'll talk about an example here in Sunset Park where they wanted to take over space for some commercial spaces. It was a Dunkin' Donuts and a parking lot. And it was about 150 units, with 35 being affordable. And folks need to remember under this only half of it really goes to the community. So we're only getting like 17 apartments. There was concerns by the community, rightfully so, I believe, since concerns that I had about the fact that our community is already overcrowded, that this was most certainly going to bring in people to the community. And so what I found interesting was the way the city had already kind of stepped in and kind of like determined some concessions in return, right? And one of them specifically was because the property was at a train station, was to, in the future, be able to create a second exit, an entrance, which is great, right? Our trains are overcrowded, but you know, being able to add another entrance or exit was not helpful when that train station was already overcrowded during rush hours to the point that it was dangerous. But also, you know, there's no conversation about future investments like an elevator, right, for folks that need it, for families, for people that you know, are wheelchairs or need it. And then, you know, these little things that when we go to Vienna, that we're here fighting for, and that we're also being told, also that I should mention that developer was also offering a parking spot for bikes. And so these little things that they're throwing at us, we're already not getting sufficient apartments. They're not at the income levels that we need. It's bringing in more people into our community. We're not talking about infrastructure. But on top of that, we're supposed to be expected to be thankful for the crumbs that they're adding, like the possible extension of the train station and like a bike parking lot. And so it's frustrating because we're fighting with developers who just look down upon community members and say, you don't know what you're talking about. When we go to Vienna and we see these things aren't crumbs that are part of a project, but they're intentional, right? Because they've done the work of actually leading through the needs of the community. And so when we see that that is possible, that it's able to do, it just gives me more fuel to continue the fight, and knowing that this is a conversation that we're starting. It was an exciting trip because it was a group of like-minded people with the same vision, and now a determination to continue to work together to see that vision come to completion. So I'm really excited about this and the continued conversation. And this is not something that we're going to be able to do overnight, but I think that the trip most importantly demonstrated to us that we can certainly build in a humane way where people are getting everything that they need and much more to live, you know, to live healthy and complete lives, right? Like we all have the opportunity to thrive. We all should have the right to have, you know, nice things and not be meant to feel like we're asking too much, right? And this is also, you know, our government is supposed to play a big part. And so we need to have a conversation about how do we build the leadership that we have within our movement? How do we create spaces so that folks can continue to move up? And understanding that in order for this to happen, we need our leadership in the state, particularly, to really be reflective of the needs of the people. And so there's a lot of electioneering work here that we need to do, but it's also understanding that we need folks in city and state agencies that also are going to be a part of the movement, where we need our folks to be present and pushing there as well. So all this to say also that the most important thing is really to the base of all of that we're going to be doing is really organizing. And I'm excited to continue the work with everyone. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. And I love that you bring it back to organizing. And just as an aside, the kind of like Vienna as being a vision of we can ask for nice things, I think is really important. Just because when we think about like the kind of like the public option or anything that's subsidized by the government in like a very concrete way in the US, there's this knee-jerk reaction of thinking of it as being a thing that's not very nice, and the kind of like the subtext all from the subtext there, and the reality there is that is a result of effective organizing on behalf of the right to paint public options as being not nice. And there's a really strong racist subtext there as well because of the racist history of housing and finance in America. But I think that it's really important to kind of like really bring that into the movements that we build, that we can have not just like decent social housing, but like nice social housing that looks nice, that looks nice from the outside, that's really nice experientially inside. So yeah, like I do as like kind of like my editorial entry point here, really, I think that's a really, really important thing for all of us to carry. So next I'm gonna go back to Councilmember Sandy Nurse. And I know that you brought up the East New York CLT in your earlier presentation, and I know that you have done a bunch of work around community land trusts, both like as a council member and also in your organizing outside and before being a council member. So could you talk a little bit more about community land trusts in your district and the work that you're doing with them?
Yeah, I can. We have one, and it's the East New York Community Land Trust in our district. So shout out to them for all the work that they've been doing to get it off the ground. And just to kind of hark back to your point, I do think we should always think that we can have nice stuff. And especially with new construction models, it's actually affordable, attainable, and totally possible. So definitely want to double down on that. But, you know, the work that's been happening in East New York, and I know some of those folks are on here listening in and have been out kind of leading the rally cry and being really vocal on all of these pieces of legislation that we've been talking about today. What I really love about coming into office in January is actually having this land trust community that is both homeowners and tenants, that is truly mostly led by Black women. It's very intergenerational, and it's a group of people that are not just focused on this one task, right? It's also focused on achieving tenant protections and preventing foreclosure and stopping gentrification. So it's not a single issue thing, the organizing that's happening around it. And as it relates to what kind of I highlighted in my little piece earlier, was that last year we had about 120 properties in primarily East New York, some in the Bushwick side of my district, but primarily in Cypress Hills, East New York, and Brownsville, that were on the tax lien sale. And it was the East New York Community Land Trust that went out and did the footwork and the outreach and door knocking. And I was able to join them a couple of times to go door knock to let people know what their options are. And that's something that the city hasn't done in a robust way to help people get off that list or to file hardship forms. And so, you know, when you have a community group, a group of people who are really passionate about making sure that the neighborhoods are able to move forward and keep people here, it's not just about one thing, it's about many things. And they've been doing so much work to try to protect home ownership, tenants, and our public land as well, because community land trust is not just based on housing, it's also about publicly owned land. Community land trust can receive that and protect it and help create democratic processes for development of that land. What should it be? I mean, it could be hospitals, it could be schools, it could be anything. The real point of it is that the land is held in an entity that is committed to collective self-determination based on principles and values that everybody has a right to a safe, stable home and certain types of activities and institutions within a neighborhood that allow all of us to thrive. So I just have one in my district, and I love that I get to be a council member with such an active group. I love that there's so many happening across New York City. This year, we were able to, you know, the city council allocated $3 million to continue to support the growth and development of that, but it was really such a small small peas. We really need a lot more funding for these organizations to both acquire properties, to be able to have enough kind of in their bank to be able to borrow and start to develop and make nice things, and to have the real capacity for staff to be dedicated to it, because it's technical work, it's heavy work, it's very hard work, and $3 million a year for X amount of for a handful of organizations is simply not enough. In addition to all the work they have to do, just organizing, and like I mentioned, the organizing that they're doing to support so many other parts of the housing justice movement. So shout out to folks who've been on the grind on this. And I know that myself and other members are really dedicated to the continued support of these kinds of institutions that are, democratizing land ownership, helping to shape the way our land is developed and on the terms that our people and our communities need it to be, rather than these folks that sit in the middle of Manhattan who get to basically gamble and bet on our communities. So that's them.
Thank you for that. And finally, my last question is for Councilmember Sanchez. Our report has 4 different subsections, and the 4th subsection that we really didn't touch on in this panel that much is about code enforcement. And just with rent regulation and rent control and laws that protect tenants, the connection might not be as clear as with like TOPA, where like it's a tool to convert private housing into social housing. But code enforcement really does the same thing of building the groundwork, as Genevieve said earlier, for creating creating the groundwork for social housing in New York City and New York State, by making it more expensive and more difficult for landlords to not take care of their buildings. And in situations where landlords are unwilling to take care of their buildings, are creating hazardous conditions for people who live in those buildings, setting the groundwork for conversions to social housing, where if a landlord is unable or unwilling to manage the building in a way that doesn't endanger tenants, then there is a pathway for the tenants to take over the building, or for a more responsible landlord, whether it's a community land trust, it's the future Social Development Housing Authority, to take the building over. So I'd love for Councilmember Sanchez to talk about her work on improving code enforcement in New York City.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Oksana. And it's part of the highest priorities that I have as chair of housing and buildings is to really take a deep look at code enforcement in the city of New York, right? One of the recommendations in the report is, of course, to implement statewide code standards. And, we're lucky, and I use air quotes, we're lucky in the city of New York that we do have very strong and robust codes. But where's the enforcement, right? Even if you look at the mayor's management report, which is updated pretty frequently to tell us, how we're doing on various goals that the city's agencies have, there's very little in there about code enforcement. We know a few things. We know that the agencies that are in charge of code enforcement in our housing are understaffed in these departments, HPD and DOB, and we know that we do an abysmal job as a city at collecting fines and fees. And so when you put those things together, we don't have the staff to actually carry out the, and enforce the high quality of housing that we want to see as a city. And then we're just not seeing that reality of, what it should be, what it should result in to have high standards for our codes. So I'm going to put in a shameless plug to all of you, everyone on this chat, on the Zoom, to please join us at the City Council on December 6th. We are going to be having a hearing on code enforcement, and it's going to be a deep dive into all of the city's programs, right? Alternative enforcement, 7A, our proactive litigation that we sometimes do very scantily, our rate of collection of when there are fines and fees, all of that to say that, protecting what we have, maintaining the housing stock today is critical, right? And if you can't do it, and you're not, you are in the business of housing, but you are not in the business of keeping people safe and treating people with dignity, you don't deserve to be in this work, right? You don't deserve to own a property where people are depending on you for heat, for hot water, for healthy conditions. And so I think, it is a critical part of this ecosystem to create social housing. If we are able to correctly and truly maintain our housing, and live up to the codes that we have enforced. And by the way, not to say that our codes are perfect. There's always room for improvement. But if we're able to live up to them, and take away properties from folks that are really not interested in maintaining properties for New Yorkers, then it can be such a big feeder into stabilizing our communities. And I also want to address something that I hear all the time, especially since becoming the chair of housing and buildings, and it's from landlords who talk about, not all of us are bad, not all of us are doing the wrong thing. There are small landlords, and I think it's something that you all, the co-authors of this report, and so many who advocate in the housing space, you do so well, and we need to exalt more, is breaking down that myth of the small landlord, the myth of the small guy who is really trying his best, but he just really can't afford this repair or that repair. It's not that doesn't exist, of course, but it's that it's few and far between, right? And I think that the city has work to do to provide and help folks that are actually the small landlords who want to help. Maybe they're an intergenerational owner of a 3-family or a 4-family house or something like that. But the vast majority of folks who are derelict and delinquent in maintaining the codes for their buildings year after year are the biggest owners, and are properties that are over leveraging their properties and getting out loans and destabilizing their property with every transaction. So that all just to say that, for me, I think about code enforcement as a critical part of the ecosystem of maintaining quality housing in New York City, but also as potentially, if we can get it right, and if we can shift the paradigm, as a feeder to a more stably housed New York City.
Thank you so much for that. Great. So thank you so much for all of your time. I really, really appreciate all of the panelists taking a substantial chunk of their day to spend with us. We just have a couple of minutes for audience Q&A, so I would encourage all of you who are still listening to put your questions in the Q&A box. And I am going to read out the 3 questions that we have so far. Between myself and the panelists, perhaps we can answer them. So the first question is from Danielle. Speaking of city land use, can the city council add a mandatory attendant member to each community board? I would love for the 2 council members on the panel to address that.
I could start or roll off. I saw that question. I was a little confused by the amount. I mean, I think a lot of community boards are made up of homeowners and tenants, if that's what you're referring to. But I mean, sure, I think community boards could always do that. But I think I would encourage tenants to just join their community boards and council members to make sure that there is a real balance when those appointment opportunities come up, that we are able to really look at all the ways that those community boards need to be reflective of the communities that they are meant to be in service of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know that community boards tend to overrepresent homeowners and drivers and higher income people, and even in my community, right? My median income for a worker is $21,000 a year. They take the subway or the bus to work. They are a renter, and yet in 3 out of my 4 community boards, the vast majority of folks, and then they're, between 25 and 45 years old, but the vast majority of members of my community boards in 3 out of the 4 are 65 and older. They're homeowners, they're drivers, and it's really incumbent upon us. I have a lot of vacancies in my community board that I'm gonna join Councilmember Norris. Please apply, please join, please. Like, I meet someone and I'm like, you're cool. You want to be on your community board? Because we really have to raise that level of civic engagement. But I don't see a harm in doing something like codifying the requirement that there is at least a couple, one or a couple tenant members. I think that's an important thing to do.
Great, thank you so much. Then there's another question. What are some effective strategies for combating NIMBYs when social housing is being developed or placed? And I think that this is kind of like an important thing to think about down the line, and is probably more important, not just for New York City, but thinking about social housing as a program that would impact the whole state. Like, how do we develop social housing in Long Island, in a community that's 95% white and has a median income of like $175,000, where a particular candidate for the governor came from. So I'm gonna open that up. This is like kind of like a big question, so I don't expect that we're going to get to a specific answer at this point, but like, I'd love to hear what you all think about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So two priors before becoming council member, I worked at RPA, the Regional Plan Association, and we worked a lot with municipalities and townships across the New York region, so Jersey, Connecticut, and New York. And this is a question that came up a lot, right? Outside of the city, and even sometimes within the city, how can you promote social housing? How can you promote affordable housing? And I always I point to Mount Laurel in New Jersey, right? Mount Laurel in New Jersey requires that municipalities are building a portion of their housing that is affordable. In Connecticut, I'm now forgetting the statute, but there's also an inclusionary that is required in some inclusionary housing that's required in some municipalities. And so it's kind of like carrots and sticks. So you create incentives to have municipalities or have states even, welcome this kind of housing in their communities. And if they refuse to do so, then there's legislative action or even lawsuits that have been brought against states in order to bring affordable and social, right? It's not necessarily called social housing, but that's in effect what it is, right? When you're creating opportunity for lower income people to be stable and to it's not that social on the matrix of the CSS, how social is that housing, but it's still something that is helping to stabilize low income people. Carrots and sticks, I guess.
Thanks for that. Does anyone else have thoughts on that question?
I have a couple. This is like, it's a very good and important question. And I think in thinking about the answer, we have to kind of like expand how we even conceive of planning housing outside of the relationship that it exists under right now, which is that right now, like if there is a need for housing in a place, the community or the government as an extension of the community can't just say, there's going to be housing here. There's this very complicated negotiating relationship that we have to do with very rich private developers and like have all of these like carrot and stick structures to like do tax breaks in exchange for affordability and all of these things. And, we're not going to get rid of that system tomorrow, but with a like, especially in the future, like a social housing development authority, we don't have to enter that same sort of weird negotiating dance where we're not under control of a bunch of the aspects of development and like can only get a small number of affordable units in a development that's like largely unaffordable and all of these other things. Like there's going to be a lot more control or a lot less opportunity for people with, I guess, bad priorities and incentives to like ruin and disrupt those projects. One big like policy aspect of that, which like how exactly this is implemented in the Social Housing Development Authority is a big outstanding question, but like it's something that, you know, happened with the development of public housing in the past, is giving the authority that develops that housing some level of ability to override the pushback at the local level against the idea of like affordable housing being, you know, built in that area, and giving the state more of a role in saying like, this is needed here, so we're going to do it here. And then another big side of this is the programs like TOPA, and like what we're thinking initially for the implementation of a social housing development authority, having a big part of the housing that's being socialized being existing housing that's received into this program. And so you don't even have to have that development fight. Like a lot of the housing that's going to be, you know, controlled by the people who live within it in this way is going to be received into the program, and is going to be able to like provide an example of how this works and how it works well before we even get to the point of development.
And I want to say one other thing about TOPA. Coming in the next few months, everything hasn't been ironed out yet, but the TOPA group is also looking to branch into like different towns in upstate New York and explain the whole TOPA process. Because right now, I think when people think of TOPA, they only think of New York City, but we're actually thinking of the whole New York State. And when you go further up in some of those communities, houses look different. So I used to live in Sullivan County, and that looks different than Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse. Even though that they're all upstate, they don't look the same. A lot of communities in Sullivan County have single family homes that are rented, duplex that are rented, maybe 4 units that are rented. They don't have those large like 60 unit buildings and stuff like that. And when you talk about something like TOPA, a lot of those people up there don't really understand what you're really talking about. And to show them what exists there in their town and explain like, look, this is the type of housing you can get and convert into the TOPA program. So yes, in the next few months, we're looking to branch into doing stuff like that into different communities. We're not really sure where exactly we're going. Rochester definitely is going to be one of them, and hopefully branch out into little smaller communities so they understand the whole TOPA process too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, first of all, I don't know why it just became like a weird shadowy figure, but it's fine because we're concluding this portion of the event. Thank you so much for all of the panelists for being here and for just like all of the amazing organizing and legislative work that you all do. Really, it's an honor to have this conversation with you, and I hope that we can continue it in the future. And now I'm going to hand the event back to Amarita, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's on our agenda for this legislative session.
Thank you so much, Oksana, and thank you to everyone for their support for this event, the tremendous and rich conversation that just took place on social housing from the local to the global level. It's been really interesting to follow along. So as we learned today, social housing is about sustainability, affordable housing that centers tenant voices, ownership, and control. It's not a new concept. In fact, it already exists in practice and legislation and in programs both locally here in New York, as we've heard today, across the country and globally in many cities around the world. And in today's housing crisis, we must seek ways to expand social housing in new and innovative ways, which our report and this discussion really clearly lays out for everyone. So while the report lays out 20 concrete steps and ways that elected officials, advocates, tenants can take action, I wanted to point out 3 important things that we'll be working on and that we hope others on this call can really take action on at the city, state, and federal level. So first, the City Council. There is legislation titled the Community Land Act, which incorporates several policies, financial structures, and rights for community land and home ownership, including the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, or COPA, the Public Land in Public Hands Bill, and another bill that would establish a public land bank. Lots of the issues and the concepts that we've spoken about today. So these pieces of legislation collectively would really help the city build the kind of policy infrastructure and financial tools for successful social housing. You should learn more about these bills and support them. They're mentioned in the report. At the state level, what's already been mentioned, something that we fight for every day at CSS, good cause eviction protection, the Housing Access Voucher Program, and the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or TOPA. All of these pieces of state legislation would provide tenants with stronger rights and financial supports for social housing. These bills would again help the social housing infrastructure across New York State. And then finally, at the federal level, we know that it's time for nationwide tenant protections. New York is a model in this respect. We have seen the devastation from COVID-19 that caused tenants across the country to face eviction. Their evictions are at a staggeringly high level, wages are stagnant, and unemployment rages on. So we need tenant protections to keep people in their homes, especially during crises. And with that, I'd like to thank again everyone for joining us today for this important discussion on social housing. Please continue to share our report, the website that you all saw, and to continue engaging in dialogue with other advocates, with elected officials that can lead to more affordable and sustainable housing that really centers tenant ownership and control. So thank you again so very much.